wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if he meant this was just for me or if it was to share it. And that's why when we had the discussion the other Sunday night, I told Phyllis, I said, well, I don't know, but this is my idea, blah, blah, blah. And then she and I talked for a long time, and I felt, yes, this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to do this. So this study on Ruth is probably going to be a little bit different from what you're used to, because I know everybody has read the book of Ruth. But this is Ruth in 1100 BC and Ruth in 2022 AD. How about that? She's got a lot that is going on in this world with us women today. A lot. So the first thing, all right, there are 5 things about Ruth that nobody talks about, but I'm doing the first one tonight. So the book of Ruth is a fascinating short story from the Hebrew scriptures, of course, where other biblical books tell of the dramatic history of the nation of Israel and even of humanity and creation itself. The story of Ruth zooms in on a day in the life account of everyday people living in rural Israel. And like I said, in 1100 BC, but it's not merely a sweet story of rural life. It's bluntly honest about the hardships and the challenges faced by women in that society, which may be familiar to some of us today. I know I've already resonated with some of the things. Sorry about that. Somebody that was wanting to come on, she says she can't join us. Okay. And as a non-Jewish person, that being me, I'm not sure if we have any Jewish ladies in our group, but anyway, living more than 3,000 years later, and I find it to be one of the most captivating and relatable of the biblical stories. I love this story. It's one of my favorites. And like me, Ruth was a non-Jewish person who came to put her faith in the God of Israel and found blessing under the wing of his care. But Ruth's story also, hang on a second, I am so sorry, it's going to keep beeping. Okay, I'm sorry. But Ruth's story also resonates with and even closely mirrors some of our personal experiences. Ruth was a young single woman who traveled across a barren desert to find a new home in a small town where she met and married a farmer. And Ruth's story challenges society's prejudices with subtle yet powerful narrative turns. And that might sound like a formula for a charming and romantic story, but it's actually the story of a courageous woman's harrowing journey across an unforgiving country to settle among a new community. And I see a lot of this same courage and gumption in so many women from my own life in the past and the present. Great heroes of the Bible, like Tamar and Deborah and Esther, of course, and others. And Ruth's is an ancient story, and it demonstrates how the God of Israel works within the everyday lives of normal people to bring about personal, national, and universal redemption. And to me, that's what this whole story is mainly about: redemption and restoration. And she takes a look at 5 things, and we're going to take a look at 5 things in this book that don't ever get talked about enough. Number 1 tonight, Ruth was disadvantaged in every way that mattered. Most people know that Ruth was a foreigner in Israel, and being a foreigner was only part of her challenge. In fact, she was marginal in just about every way that mattered in the ancient Near East. She was the ancient equivalent of an undocumented alien, hailing from an enemy foreign power. Her arrival would have aroused the same kind of unease that the arrival of Syrian refugees in Europe and American cities do today. And everything from her accent, to her hair, to her dress would have broadcast to everyone in Bethlehem, this girl ain't from around here. And on top of that, she was a religious outsider. She came from a land where people worshiped hideous idols and practiced human sacrifice. You read about that in 2 Kings 3:27, if you like. She had renounced her people's gods, but many of the good people of Bethlehem would be more or little wary of her. She was also a husbandless and sonless woman. In ancient Near Eastern society, where the value of women were largely based on their relationship to male relatives, that was a problem. And seeing as she had already been married for some time, perhaps 10 years, Ruth 1:4 alludes to that, and failed to produce a son, her prospects of finding another husband were not great, just to put it mildly. Okay, that was number one. That's what we're talking about tonight. So we'll start out with a question. Describe a time in your life where things did not go as you expected. Anyone?
You mean just anything?
Anything. Yeah, anything.
Anything. Oh my girl. Well, God, there's so much to choose from. Where to begin? Well, I'm just going to start at like when I came, before God remolded me into the woman I am. I already had the faith because God and I had talked about it before he started, remolding me. But it was still a little bit scary because you don't know. And the unknown, not like God's spirit, not being able to see him or anything, because, I don't have a problem with that. But just being terrified that I was going to disappoint and stuff like this, that bothered me a little bit. So I tried to keep just as close as I could to him, but then we all fall short. The more I read the Bible and the more I learned and the more he molded me, the more I learned. And, he knows we're still going to make mistakes. So I think that was a huge part when I first started, and letting him return me to himself in his own way. But it was a little bit scary to me. But I just didn't want to disappoint, and I still don't want to disappoint God.
Right.
But I think it was a blessing in many ways, but it took years, to get to this stage where I feel as comfortable as I do with my God for today. But I still don't want to disappoint. I really don't, but we would make mistakes.
Yeah, right.
But that was one of mine.
Yeah, I mean, I've had jobs before that didn't turn out the way I expected them to. I mean, that's one for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we've all had things to happen in our lives that didn't turn out the way we wanted them to. And how were the results unexpected? How did you feel when things didn't turn out the way you envisioned them? But we're gonna dive into Ruth now, a story about two widows who experienced the unexpected. Their story begins, excuse me, my mouth is so dry today. Their story begins with the death of their husbands, but we'll see how God works behind the scenes. to bring about their redemption. So Ruth is a story about how God moves even when we don't see him working. And I'll give you some background on the time period of Judges, because that's really where this story came out of. The Judges, after Israel conquered the promised land, the Israelites continued to fall into sin. So God brought judgment. The people cried out to God for rescue, and he appointed the judges to deliver them from their enemies. And Israel would eventually rebel again, and the cycle just continued. And the period of the Judges is where we find Ruth's story. So you can read more about that in Judges. I'm not going into that. That's a long one. So what is the initial problem set up in verse 1 of Ruth?
I think that she was an outsider and disadvantaged, felt like an alien and all this. She had a lot of that going on, you know. But as we know, and as we grow with God, I do believe that she had her faith. And even though, you know, being an outsider, because even with a job or anything that you do, if it's your first time going into it, I get a little nervous, you know, and stuff like this, but I didn't feel that bad, you know, thank God. You know, yes, I probably wouldn't have never lasted but a minute, but no, I think, well, from what I read in my first chapter, you know.
No, verse 1, Betty. Verse 1, honey.
Ruth and her disadvantage, you know, feel like an outsider and all that. Well, I can't even imagine feeling like that, you know, because I don't think I've ever felt like an outsider, except when I was maybe going through that drama where my testimony come in. I might have felt like an outsider then because I felt so lost. That's the only way I could compare myself to her on that on verse 1. So, but
actually there was a famine to begin with. There was a famine in the country, and Elimelech he tried to solve the problem by moving his family to Moab. And so Ruth opens up actually with famine, and in a desperate attempt to provide for his family, Elimelech flees Israel from Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. And Moab was actually described as a godless, evil, sinful country. And so the people of Moab characterized godlessness. And at that time, and God had forbidden the Moabites from entering the assembly. And that's brought out in Deuteronomy 23, 3-6. Now, why did God banish the Moabites from entering the Israelite community? Because they did not help the Israelites when they left Egypt. Instead, they tried to curse Israel. And the fact that Elimelech's sons took Moabite wives, that would have raised a red flag anyway for the contemporary readers. These women are bad news, plain out, they're bad news. But we'll see through the book that Ruth ends up being quite the opposite of that. Now, what happens to the men at the beginning of the story? In Ruth 1 and verse 5, describe Naomi.
She was widowed and her sons died too.
Right.
I mean, no, the whole problem was that she had moved into this other country unexpectedly, basically, because of the famine. And they get over there, and not only is she widowed, her 2 sons die.
That's right.
So that's pretty life-shattering right there.
Exactly.
She's in a strange land, lost her husband, lost the sons,
Yeah.
Just it's devastating. You're right. Even back then, it would have been devastating. It would be devastating now.
Exactly. Exactly. I can't even imagine. Hmm. But there are a lot of passages in the Bible about the widows. I'm not going to read it. Exodus, Deuteronomy, and First Timothy and James. So from the Old Testament even to the New Testament, the widows are talked about. And if y'all have read any of that, how would you summarize God's attitude toward the widows? How does knowing God's heart for widows inspire you to even serve widows in your life? I mean, to me, he was a defender of them, and he expected them to be taken care of. All these verses, there's so many of them, like I said, that talks about that.
I didn't realize, but well, when you become a widow and you lose a spouse, I literally asked the Lord. I said, "Okay, Lord, now what am I supposed to do?" And He answered me as plain as the nose on my face. He said, "Now you will have to depend on me." And I don't want this to sound bad, but I am now, I think, closer to the Lord, or I spend more time, obviously, since I've become widowed. I mean, when you don't have the spouse to take up your time, and my daughter's grown, and I don't know, it's like you have a whole new appreciation for what the Lord has done for you.
Right.
You know what? Because
Yeah.
hey, I ain't got no help. I mean, it's me. I have no help other than the Lord. And literally you have to depend on him, because I mean, my husband took care of my car, he took care of my yard. My husband did all that stuff. There was
Right.
a lot of stuff he didn't do, a whole lot he didn't do. But anyway, you have to it's very life altering.
Sure it is.
The only way to get through it and keep your sanity is to know that God is in control and he knows every single thing before it happens. Now,
Amen.
I didn't like being widowed at age 56, I can tell you that, but my thinking and everything, it's changed me. I mean, it's life changing.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a bad way. I mean, it's very, very, it's hard to explain. I had no idea until I went through it. I had no idea what my mother went through. I had no idea what friends went through. It's one of those things you can't really know until it happens to you. And it's kind of altering. Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. And God's heart for the widows has not changed. And even though widows in our day, maybe they have more opportunities than Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, the women today can own land and have jobs and provide for their needs. And they still can face tremendous difficulties, such as being a single mother and trying to make ends meet on one income, and not only the grief and the isolation, of course, but the call of God on our lives remains the same when it comes to the widows. And it's very specific in the Bible, in the Old Testament, all the way to the New Testament, that we should care for them. And who, according to the text, reverses the famine in verse 6.
The Lord.
Chapter 1. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So in verse 6, excuse me, in verse 6, we learn that God has lifted the famine in Israel. And the word used to describe God's action is hagad, which often translates as visits or comes to the aid of or has concern for. It's a Hebrew word. and is used throughout the Old Testament. I'm sorry, y'all. Hold on just a minute. It is used throughout the Old Testament to describe God's action of provision for his people. For example, when God allows Sarah to conceive Isaac, he visited her. And when Moses and Aaron spoke of God's plan to rescue the Israelites from Egypt, the people realized that God had visited them. And God intervenes in the lives of his people to provide for their needs. So we'll see through the rest of the book of Ruth that God works behind the scenes to bring about his purposes in the lives of the two widows. And the change in the famine is one of the most blatant acknowledgments of God's involvement in the book of Ruth. God isn't passively watching Naomi suffer. He's actively working to restore her. In verse 8 and 9, I'm going to read that one. I'm going to read those two. Verses 8 and 9, if I can see. After a short while on the road, Naomi told her two daughters-in-law, go back, go home, live with your mothers, and may God treat you as graciously as you've treated your deceased husbands and me. May God give each of you a new home and a new husband. She kissed them and they cried openly. Now, what does Naomi pray for her daughter-in-law?
That God blesses them.
Them, shows them kindness, and that
Yes.
they would find rest in the home of another husband.
That's
Yeah.
right.
So why do you think Naomi prayed those things for Ruth and Orpah?
Maybe because she wasn't able to do for them. She knew that they needed help. She wasn't able to do for them.
Right. She wanted God to extend his loving kindness to them. And this kind of love, the Hebrew word hesed, means loyal, dedicated, persistent, and sacrifice. And Naomi's speech introduces the theme of loyal love, or hesed, that carries throughout the book of Ruth. And that, to me, that's what a lot of this book is about, the loyalty and the love in this story. Now, in the Hebrew, Naomi asked that God would deal kindly with Orpah and Ruth as they have done to her and her dead husband and sons. And the Hebrew word hesed holds more meaning than just kindness. It also means loyalty, love, and devotion. And it's the kind of love that will endure pain, personal sacrifice, and loss, that will put anything on the line in order to remain loyal to another person. Something we need in this world today, loyalty.
Yes.
For Naomi, Ruth and Orpah have been loyal to her, so she asked God's hesed to follow them back to their homeland. And hesed is used 3 times in Ruth. Ruth 1:8, 2:20, and 3:10, and either describes God or Ruth. Ruth exhibits hesed toward Naomi, is seen through her actions throughout the whole story. And God pours out his hesed on Naomi and Ruth throughout the whole story. So the only hope for Ruth and Orpah to remarry, from Naomi's perspective, was for them to return to Moab. And as mentioned before, Moabites were not desirable spouses. And going back to Bethlehem seemed like a one-way ticket to permanent poverty for Naomi and her daughter-in-law. Ruth, okay, I'm going to reread this too. Ruth 1:16 and 17. But Ruth said, don't force me to leave you. Don't force me to leave you. Don't make me go home. Where you go, I go. Where you live, I'll live. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I'll die. And that's where I'll be buried. So help me God. Not even death itself is going to come between us. She was adamant about that, wasn't she? She really
Yeah.
was.
Mhm.
All right, let me see where I stopped. Okay. So what strikes you about Ruth's promise to Naomi? What all does Ruth give up to follow her mother-in-law?
I want to make a comment.
Yeah,
Ruth's devotion and loyalty and commitment to Naomi, her mother-in-law, is a picture of God's commitment to Naomi.
that's right.
Also,
Right.
God, the whole picture, God will never leave us, never forsake us. He's always knows what's going on. That's a complete picture. And at the same time, it's also a picture of our all Christians' response to loyalty and commitment to the Lord.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Exactly.
Good. I like that.
One thing that has been speaking to me since you read those verses was when she said that even unto death, like where you die is where I'll die. And I kind of relate that to our relationship with the Lord. It's how far are we willing to go in our walk with him? Are we willing to go to death? Are we willing to go every step of the way, die where he dies, on the hill that he was, buried on? And that, is really, like you said, loyalty and committed and honorable, because how many of us can say, it's easy for us to stand with someone, to be committed to someone when things are good, when we're walking on up the mountain and everything's fine. But, even unto death, where she was going to be buried, she was saying, that's where I'll be. I will go with you even until death, even when things are not good. I'm not just going to betray you and leave you when hardships come.
Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. So she gave up her country,
Mhm.
her God, her family, her security, her future, the chance of possibly remarrying. She just didn't know what God was planning. And I love that. I thought about that so much this week. I'm like, girl, you don't know what God has planned for you. So how does Ruth's promise to Naomi demonstrate the Hesed? I think Stephanie just hit that. I think she just nailed that. So Ruth promises, of course, to remain faithful to Naomi.
Mhm.
God is faithful to us, and we're supposed to be faithful to him. And so who personifies faithfulness for you? Jesus does for me, and I know he does for you ladies.
Mhm.
How has his faithfulness impacted your life?
Well, whenever I'm faced with a trial, sorry, I'm trying to eat dinner and I got a mouthful, but whenever I'm facing something and I, say to myself, I don't know how I'm going to get to the end of this. There is no way possible that this situation is going to be resolved. There is no way that, I'm going to see this through. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. His faithfulness allows me to stand on that firm foundation and say, you know what? He's done it before and he'll do it again. I may not see the end. I may not see his hand working, in my situation, but I have to trust that it is, even when I can't see it, because he is faithful, because he cannot fail, he cannot lie, and he promised to never leave us. And so that is what, that's how I've seen his faithfulness in my life, and how I hold on to that faithfulness when I feel like, I may not see an end to certain situations, or I may question and say, well, Lord, you said that all things work together for the good, and I may not see the good in this, but I have to believe that even though they may not be good to me, it's definitely going to be good for me. And he's going to use it for my good and for his glory.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Mhm.
So think about, okay, what would it look like for you to be like Ruth in your friendships, in your marriage, in your work relationships, your church? And what might you have to sacrifice to selflessly serve others as Ruth served Naomi?
It's rewarding. If you're doing God's work, it is. But when you do it outside of maybe, boundaries that as long as you're doing it in boundaries, in the proper boundaries with Christ, yes, it's very rewarding to be. It is very rewarding.
Yeah. But we have to work at it.
Yes.
We have to work at it. Yeah. It doesn't just happen. We have to work at it. Just like our relationship with Christ, we have to work. So when Naomi arrives in Bethlehem, remember she changes her name.
Yes.
And what does Mara mean?
Oh, I don't know.
Bitter.
Bitter.
Bitter. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Right.
he said that. They're bitter with him.
She was very bitter. Very bitter. And so, and who does she blame for her bitterness, her circumstances?
She said the Almighty has afflicted me, but I don't think that's true.
In her eyes, yes, that she blamed.
That's what she said. That's what she said.
Yes, she was blinded by grief, and she can only see part of the picture anyway. So she blames God. She says he's brought the calamity on her life, but as we saw before, he's actually working to restore her. She doesn't realize the greatest gift is Ruth, and describes her situation as empty. She doesn't see it yet. God is working on both of these ladies big time, but they just don't know. They don't see it. But how is Ruth's response different than Naomi's? And though both Ruth and Naomi find themselves in the same situation, they both lost their husbands, their homes, their hopes for remarriage. Ruth responds with faithfulness, sacrifice, selflessness. And the author of Ruth is pointing out in the Bible, of course, is pointing out subtle irony. The foreigner imitates God's character and better than the one, Naomi, who was of his chosen people. So that the irony in that is blatant. Naomi freely admitted to her bitterness. Can you relate to Naomi? I can.
Yes.
I've been bitter many times. I have. And I mean, let's be honest about it. We have, like Stephanie was talking about a while ago, we have situations that sometimes they're so horrible, we just don't know how we're going to get out of them. And we know God is there. He's going to take care of us, but we can't see it sometimes. I mean, I've had bitterness in my heart. I admit it, and I've had to really get on my knees and pray through that. If you've ever felt bitter, why were you upset with him? I mean, he's done, or he's allowed things in our lives before that we didn't understand, and we know, he allowed it because he's in control. But many God-fearing people fall into bitterness, and God doesn't always work in the ways we want him to, does he?
No,
And no, and to Naomi, God had made her life miserable. But we'll see through the rest of the story how he goes about restoring her. You think it's healthy to live with bitterness?
no,
No.
no.
What might be the consequences of never dealing with bitterness in your heart?
Oh, well, yeah, well, I think we got to deal with it, but not let it consume you. Like you
Right.
said, it takes time, even for our salvation. That took time. So,
That's right.
bitterness, that's one word. And yes, that can mess you up. But the more that we learn, like I said, through that, even though you might have been upset and just wanted somebody to blame, so she blamed God. But the more she learns about God or what God's getting ready to do for her is when she's going to change.
Right.
We don't have to see it. We can't see God. I know he's there because he's spirit, and the Bible says he is. So I don't have to see him to know that he's there. But I don't doubt that he's there.
That's right. Because we have faith. We know he's
That's
there.
right.
Our
That's
faith
right.
tells us. So,
But like
we
you said a
can't
while ago,
stay
too,
bitter.
it don't come all at once. We don't get all this at once. It has to stretch out. That's
That's right.
God's way. Because our
That's
way,
right.
we can't do it.
No, we can't.
A long time ago, when I told God, take me and remold me, and that's what he did, and I just waited. I just waited and stayed as close to him as I could. And that's
right.
what you do. Like
Yeah.
Stephanie, she knows. And yes, because us, being of a sinful world, we've all been, bitterness, one
That's
thing or
right.
another. I'm
Well,
guilty.
Bitterness
Yeah.
can make you sick.
It
Bitter,
can.
bitter means tasted bad. Bitterness causes negativity. Bitterness causes people to turn away from you. Bitterness
Yeah.
causes you to turn away from people. Bitterness causes you to turn away from God. So
Yes.
there is I've coined the phrase, swallow the bitter pill. And it's not healthy at all in any area in your life, physically, mentally, spiritually, or anything.
That's
That's right.
exactly right. That's right. And we just can't stay bitter toward
No.
God either. And it ruptures our relationship with him
Yes.
and with, like you said, with other people. So what's compelling in Naomi's story is God works in ways that she doesn't immediately recognize to bring her from bitterness to blessing.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
right. So it may seem like God is absent from the book of Ruth, and the characters reference him, but the narrator never includes God as the main figure. He doesn't speak or do anything directly. And there are several other Old Testament stories where God seems silent. The book of Esther and the book of Job. Esther became the queen over Persia and eventually, of course, saved the Jewish people from death. But God's name is never mentioned in the story, and it's obvious he's working on behalf of his people. Job loses everything, his family, his health, his possessions, and he cries out to God for the majority for the majority of the book of Job until God finally speaks at the end of the book. Of course, the girls did the Bible study on Esther, and go back and read Esther and read Job. But the story tells us that what does Esther and Job's story tell us about God's presence in our own circumstances? Does God ever abandon his people? How does Esther and Job prove that to be true? What do you feel when you feel forgotten? Do you ever feel forgotten by God? how do you remind yourself of God's presence? He's quiet a lot of times. He's been too quiet in my life at times. And I'm like, where are you? I mean, just, speak it out. Where are you, Lord? I mean, I don't feel you. I can't, I need you. I need your word. But he, like she said, he promised to never leave us. So even though God doesn't directly act in the book of Ruth, we see him acting behind the scenes. God never abandoned his people, and he works in ways that we can't always see. And I'm going to read the last verse 22. And so Naomi was back, and Ruth the foreigner was with her, back from the country of Moab. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
Mhm.
We're not getting into that tonight. That is going to be next week. But the barley harvest is vital in the story. How does the fact that the women arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest imply hope is on the horizon? Well, we sometimes believe the lie that says God ceases to move when we harden our hearts against him. The life of Naomi proves the opposite. God works in the lives of his people, even if they are bitter against him, and our actions will not change his character.
That's
He
right.
orchestrated Naomi and Ruth's lives so they arrived just in time for the harvest season, despite Naomi's bitterness. God doesn't change his character, and if we are bitter, lonely, or brokenhearted, it doesn't matter. God does not change.
That's right.
And how might someone in a situation similar to Naomi's be encouraged by God's never changing character? Well, the first chapter of Ruth reminds us that God sometimes moves in ways that we don't anticipate. When have you been surprised by God's movement in your life? How has he used unexpected people or events in your walk with him? Anybody think of anything?
I think I call that an alignment, where God gets things in line, but I don't see it, but I feel the presence that something is getting ready to happen, but I don't know what it is. And I said, well, I know that is God's spirit, and I know it's probably going to be great, because he knows I can't handle a whole bunch of big things at one time. It's just that, sometimes I know, but I don't know what it is.
Right.
But I'm sure as long as God's in it, it's going to be great. And usually it is. Most of the time it's a blessing. Then sometimes it's 2 or 3 blessings, but it's just so unexpectedly, but it's coming. You can sense it's coming in your spirit. And that could just get, you can ask Phyllis, I just get overwhelmed. I have got 3 blessings today. I don't know what, I know God loves me, but I didn't know he loved me this much. She said, girl, but just little stuff like that, and it just touches my soul. I feel like God has just come and just jumped through my body, and it's just a very uplifting thing. And half the time it just makes me want to cry, because it's very emotional. You don't know. I think the anticipation of it, just like anticipating prayers that we have for somebody. I'm looking for the blessing. I say that a lot. I'm looking for the blessings. These people, we call out their names and stuff. I'm waiting, anticipating. I'm waiting on God.
That's right.
That's right. It. I don't have it. Do you have it? I don't have it. God's got it. There you go. That about makes me want to shout right there.
There you go. Well, I'll say this. If you're not dead, then God ain't done.
That's
That's
right.
it. I agree. I agree with that.
Yep.
I like that.
I do.
Well, even if life seems more chaotic, and we know it is, because we know we're
Mhm.
living in the end days and never before, God has not forgotten us. And
No.
we see in the lives of Ruth and Naomi that he moves on our behalf. He moved on their behalf, and he moves like Betty was just talking about. He moves on our behalf.
Yes,
And
he
we
does.
don't know when, but we believe that he will.
Yes.
So our circumstances sometimes blind us from God's hand, but we can put our faith in the God who sees the plight of his children and acts. And in
Yes.
the New Testament, Jesus never promises us an easy life. We know that. John 16:33. And we see that Jesus ensures the opposite. We will have trouble in this world. The people we love most may die. We might lose our possessions, dignity, security, whatever. But we serve a faithful God who sees the plight of the oppressed and
Mhm.
never abandons us. So
Yes.
remember, my words, if you're not dead, then God ain't done with you.
That's right.
That's what.
He's with you. He's with
That's
me.
right.
He's with
Yes.
us, and sees us, and he will never leave us. We've got that promise. That's one of his promises. And I rely on that promise a lot. And we can take comfort in his promises and learn to walk in faithfulness just as Ruth did.
Mhm.
Yes, ladies, I'm going to close this out tonight, and I'm calling it Live It Out. Okay.
I like
So
that.
I
pray
like that.
first. When we pray, and y'all probably do this, begin each day thanking God for his love toward you. Ask him to give you opportunities throughout the day, throughout the week, to love others. There's so many unlovable people out there. And ask God to put someone who is unlovable in your path so you can love them. Confess. If you're feeling bitter towards God, pull a trusted friend aside, maybe someone from our group, someone from your church, and be honest with them about how you feel. Try to figure out why you're upset with God and pray together.
Yeah.
Just, yeah. I mean, I know we're all available here. We can pray with anybody.
Yep.
Then relationships. Ruth displayed incredible love for Naomi in this chapter. Pick a relationship this week to focus on and come up with ways that you can sacrificially love that person. Like I said, there's a lot of unlovable people in our lives. I'm thinking of some right now. I'm having a lot of issues with. And I know a lot of you keep journals. I know Phyllis does. But think back on your life and pinpoint moments God moved in ways that you didn't expect. Just think about that. We couldn't really come up with a whole lot while ago, but just stop and think about that sometime this week. Reflect on God's involvement in those events and praise him for never abandoning you. And then
Yes.
lastly, evaluate. Consider how you've handled past or current pain. See how God has matured you over the years, and pray that he would continue to mature your faith in the midst of difficulty. And that is it tonight. So next week, your assignment is, gotta find it. Well, sir.
It's about like me looking for something tonight and couldn't find it.
Next week is short. Ruth, the story, I mean, the session's not short, but your assignment is. All right, Ruth 2, just verses 1 through 4. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
We're not going to get through all 4 of these chapters fast.
No,
So they're going to be dissected. Okay.
I like that. Yeah.
Okay.
I like it. It was
Okay.
wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Phew. Okay, session 1 down. Any questions, any comments, ladies?
I loved it. You've done a wonderful job. And, I really enjoyed it. I really did. I enjoyed reading it. I said, I can't wait to see what she's got to say, because I got notes, I got notes.
Yeah, I was
But,
kind of surprised when, I mean, I've always loved this story. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. Of course, I've got a whole bunch, but this is one of my favorites. And I was really surprised when he told me he wanted me to do this. And I'm like, everybody's heard this story. I mean, here I am messing with God. Everybody has heard this story. What could possibly be brought out that hasn't been brought out?
Well, I've got a question. Has anybody heard something new tonight in the story of Ruth and a different perspective? I have. So you obviously have something for us, and God is using you for us to learn. That last little commentary you made me think of an event, and I don't want to start up the study again or anything. This is really short, but many years ago, I had to go to an EAP because I had went through some physically stressful things, and the nurse administrator said that I had to go before I could come back to work, and before they would release me to come back to work, they wanted me to go and talk to somebody because they wanted to make sure that I was even not just physically, but I was emotionally able to come back to work and do my job. So I was talking to him, and he said, well, think about what the worst thing is that could happen. And I went, well, I don't know. Maybe you lose your job. He said, really? He said, that would be the worst thing that could happen. I went, well, you could maybe lose your home. Or he said, really, is that the worst thing? And I went, well, surely you're not talking about me losing my children or something. He said, well, wouldn't that be the worst thing that could happen? Or losing your family or losing your loved ones? And I went, well, yeah. He said, well, then it's not the worst thing in the world that's happened to you, has it? I went, no. So I'm going to put this on a spiritual level. What's the worst thing that could happen to you spiritually? What would be the worst thing? It would be falling out of favor or out of grace with God. That would be the worst thing.
Yeah.
And the only thing that could do that is it would be me, because nothing the Bible tells us can separate us from the love of God. That little commentary you did at the end made me think about that incident, and then thinking of it on a spiritual level. What would be the worst thing spiritually that could happen is if I turned my back on God, or if I lost favor, or if I lost the grace of God in my life.
Right.
It would be, I could live in a mud hut. I could live sick. I could live any way, but I can't live without him. Not without him. Thank you, Coleen. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Yep.
You're welcome.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Enjoyed it.
Yep.
Okay,
It was
good.
good.
If anybody doesn't have any other questions or comments about the lesson, I'm going to stop recording. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.